Welcome to Futures Hub, the podcast that ignites curiosity and navigates the pathways to tomorrow. I'm Mia, your guide on this journey into the future, where we explore the art of co-creation, community engagement, and foresight. In each episode, we dive deep into innovative techniques to unlock the potential to shape our individual capacities and contribute to vibrant communities. Whether you're a seasoned futurist or just dipping your toes into the world of foresight, let's embark on this journey together. Welcome to Futures Hub. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Futures Hub. I'm your host, Mia. Our typical format of podcast episodes have been conversations with guests working in the space of co-creation, foresight, and community engagement, with the exception of season launch and finale episodes. Today will be such an exception, because after today, the podcast will be placed on pause. However, and with that being said, this is not necessarily a goodbye, but rather a see you later. In this episode, we'll be exploring exactly why, and we'll take the opportunity to step back together and look at Futures Hub as a whole, not just as a podcast, but as a living, evolving experiment. I'll be sharing how Futures Hub came to be, how it's since evolved, and what it's uncovered about Futures work and practice. Depending on how you've discovered the podcast, it may or may not come as a surprise that Futures Hub didn't start as a media project primarily. Rather, it started as a research question. Prior to founding Futures Hub, I was in the midst of academic research into how Futures tools could potentially bridge people's individual, personal development, and community growth. More specifically, my research began with the question of how might personal Futures tools create a positive connection between individual and community flourishing, if at all. Through this research, I was pairing my personal passion and interest in continued education and development with my love of community. This research can be found in further detail linked in the show notes or in OCAD University's Open Research Repository. But ultimately, it was a time-bound experience focusing on researching Futures tools, applying them within an individual context, bringing them into community spaces, and measuring their impact both individually and collectively on a sense of flourishing. After research wrapped up, I was left with lingering questions. The sense that this research wasn't done, that there was so much more left to do, and that we could all benefit as individuals and communities from spaces to collectively dream about and create the future together. The grand vision of Futures Hub was community hubs of the future. Third spaces, neither work nor home, but something else, where people can come together to experience and dream about the future together. Literal physical spaces, part watering hole, part boardroom, part art installation, part community center. But recognizing the constraints of space, time, and resources, I tried to puzzle out what some micro ways of experimenting with this idea might look like. There were many people I admired that were already working in this space, and thus the podcast became a way to explore these concepts in a collective, to share the knowledge, to dream together, perhaps not in person, but remotely. From the beginning, instead of seeing Futures Hub as a place to share answers, it began as a method of inquiry. Each conversation became a space of evolving ideas, of learning and dreaming and discovering together. Inadvertently, conversations revealed how people naturally talk about the future, which foresight tools resonate and which fall flat or short, and why, and what actually creates a sense of connection between personal reflection, individuals, and broader systems or communities. Over time, the podcast grew into a space of its own, not in a formal or academic way, but in a way where theory and lived experience met. I've had the profound privilege from these early beginnings of meeting with people from across the globe to discuss new concepts. And it was from these amazing guests that it was flagged for me that a community was developing around Futures Hub, something created organically in shared passion and belief of better futures for all. Featuring guests from various sectors, various countries, and continents, but with a shared openness to explore the past, present, and future together has been such a profound honor for me along this journey. Since launch, just over 3 years ago, we've had in-depth conversations with more than a dozen guests from across 5 different continents and have been streamed in over 46 different countries. While it would be impossible and would not do justice to the content to try and summarize everything that I've discussed with these various guests into a few bite sized pieces, I'm happy to share some insights I recently uncovered when reflecting upon the Futures Hub journey for a recent presentation on strategy and foresight. These are 3 key takeaways I shared that I uncovered as I reflected upon the Futures Hub journey. Going through the Futures Hub evolution has been a humbling experience, reminding me of the quote, "The more you know, the more you realize you don't know." The Futures Hub journey has been one of endless evolution and constant discovery. And these insights are things that I have learned as I've gone through that journey in particular, having grown with the evolution and growth of Futures Hub and its various initiatives. For some, these insights may seem like common sense. For others, they may perhaps be helpful. Regardless of where they fall, I share them today for your consideration. First, recognizing that people already hold futures thinking within them. For all the tools and terminology that foresight work may contain, people don't need to be taught how to think about the future. They're already doing it constantly. Through their expectations, their fears, their hopes, their decisions, there is no lack of futures thinking in our field or in the wild. However, for those who may work in institutional or organizational spaces, foresight work isn't often recognized as such. Or sometimes these connections aren't made or are siloed. For example, considered within the realm of marketing or communications. The thought that lived experience or storytelling of lived experience comes with content creation rather than as the foundation for strategy and long term planning. The individual connection and reflection is so important to the work that we do as either foresight or strategy professionals. Effective foresight work recognizes this and creates the space and connections for individual experiences to be recognized. And I say that within the context of foresight or strategy professionals, but truly this applies to anyone working or existing or moving in community spaces, both quote unquote history and future, as terms on their own sound grand and sweeping. But what we often forget is that both history and the future are made up of individuals living their lives, remembering and dreaming every day. And we lose something when we lose sight of this, that every individual is inherently a futures expert. The second takeaway that I was recently reflecting upon when reflecting on the evolution of Futures Hub is that experimentation is key for futures thinking. Futures thinking can often feel abstract, high stakes. These feelings of abstract significance may especially be found in large institutional settings. But what became clear to me over time is that experimentation isn't just a way to approach futures work. It became the ethos of Futures Hub itself. From the very beginning, Futures Hub was never a fixed or fully formed concept. It was a series of small experiments, the podcast being one of them. Each episode, each conversation, each iteration was a way of testing what resonates, what creates connection, what actually helps people engage with the future in a meaningful way. In that sense, the podcast wasn't just exploring experimentation, it was enacting it. It was a low risk prototype that allowed ideas to be explored in real time without needing full clarity or certainty upfront. And this connects to the previous insight about individuals. Futures perhaps flourish best through the creation of small, contained ways for people to engage with it. Whether it's through a quick conversation, a short exercise, or a temporary installation. What happens when we invite people to play, to experiment, to try futures on for size? This is something we had to learn through doing at Futures Hub, not just through conversation, but through building Futures Hub piece by piece, testing formats, adjusting approaches, and allowing the work itself to evolve. Adoption doesn't usually happen through one big shift. Rather, it happens through repeated, low-risk exposures that builds familiarity and cohesion over time. So as we show up in spaces, as we work with communities, or as we participate in communities ourselves, how can we create these small, subtle shifts or experiences that create the future over time. And as a last takeaway, but certainly not the least takeaway, when reflecting on Futures Hub and the evolution of this work, is the recognition that how we design for involvement in Futures work matters just as much as the content itself. Early on, I often thought about this in terms of engagement. How do we get people interested, involved, paying attention? But over time, I started to see the limits of that framing. Oftentimes, engagement can manifest passively. For example, in digital communications and marketing, getting a like on a social media post is considered a form of engagement. However, there's a world of difference in the insight that can be gleaned from a like versus a comment. What I began to notice through the Futures Hub journey is that meaningful futures work requires something deeper than passive engagement. It requires people to see themselves as part of the process, not just reacting to ideas about the future, but contributing to them. This became clear not just through conversations, but through trying to design experiences differently and seeing what changed when people were invited to actively shape the space. By building upon lessons 1 and 2, it becomes possible to lay the groundwork for this third insight. By anchoring into some key design principles in our work with community, in our work in community, and in our work with ourselves, such as focusing on making experiences tangible and interactive, allowing for multiple entry points, and creating space for reflection alongside contribution, we begin to shift from people observing futures work to actually participating in it in a meaningful way. We can create experiences that enable futures to become something people can feel, not just analyze, and therefore meaningfully and genuinely participate in shaping the future. In the Futures Hub journey, the Futures Room concept and installation became a physical manifestation of this preliminary research and these three ideas. It's important to note that the Futures Room didn't emerge fully formed. It was the result of everything that came before it. The research, the podcast conversations, and the ongoing experimentation all led towards this idea for something more embodied, more interactive, and more participatory. The Futures Room was a participatory Foresight installation hosted as part of a 3-day program on the futures of creativity and compassion in 2025 between the Association of Professional Futurists and OCAD University. It was set up and styled as a cozy living room space, with self-guided stations exploring different futures tools. Individuals were able to enter this space and reflect on their future, while leaving behind artifacts that contributed to a growing and evolving discussion about the future in the midst of this community. In many ways, the Futures Room is a manifestation of all three takeaways just discussed. Starting with personal reflection, using low-risk, self-guided interactions as a form of experimentation, and designing the space so people could actively contribute, not just observe. Through items such as a shared milestone mapping tool, people could see, for example, that what might feel like an ordinary day or year for one person could be one of dramatic significance for another. Through a shared futures wall, individuals could contribute to an evolving dialogue that captured people's hopes and dreams and fears. Insights were developed organically by each individual based on where they were at, how they were perceiving the experience, what they were ready and willing to either leave behind or take away. The Futures Room was yet another iteration of Futures Hub that we couldn't have possibly anticipated at the organization's inception, and yet which felt entirely natural to move towards. And yet, building through this work, in addition to all the beautiful insights being discovered, is the fact that futures work exists at intersections and tensions, perhaps only natural and expected for work that deals with wicked problems. Something that we've repeatedly heard from guests on the podcast, and which also began manifesting and surfacing through this work, were the many tensions and contradictions that could exist in such a fruitful space. Tensions between reach and depth, between desire and reality, between urgency and capacity. It begs the question of how do you account for the time and energy to sustain futures work or community work, to sustain something like this podcast alongside other work that may have more immediate or visible outcomes. And that loops us back to putting the podcast on pause. Putting the podcast on pause isn't about stepping away from this work. It's about being more intentional about our focus. Right now, that looks like going deeper into more interactive and community based formats, more embodied approaches to futures work, more networking in this space to see how we can support people actively working in community, and continuing to explore how personal reflection connects to collective futures. This podcast has been a really important part of the Futures Hub journey, but we recognize it's not the only way to do it. We also recognize that in an increasingly polarized world looking for straight answers, clear beginnings, and firm endings, yeses or nos, we do not have to, nor often can we even exist in that space. It's important to navigate the tensions, to understand that two things may exist and be true at once without negating one or the other. It's important to recognize that we don't need to automatically cancel or end something, that we can reflect, we can pause. So, this is where we're at now, a pause, a step back. And in so doing, and in reflecting on all of this, taking the opportunity to share the research, the conversations, the experiments. I think the biggest takeaway for me in all of this is the confirmation and reaffirmation that futures work is community work. That futures are about stories, lived experiences, and relationships. That futures work cannot be done alone or in isolation. That it takes every single one of us. A reflection on ourselves, yes, but also the recognition that we are all part of something bigger. We are all connected in ways big and small, sometimes in ways that are visible, sometimes in ways we can't even yet imagine. In recognizing this, I'm truly grateful to everyone who's been part of this in some way, shape, or form. The conversations, ideas, and reflections don't stop here. I can't wait to see what form they take next. For now, thank you for being part of the Futures Hub podcast and journey. I can't wait until we meet again. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your network. Tag us on Instagram or LinkedIn, share your thoughts, and let's keep the discussion going about how we can shape better futures together. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, keep imagining, keep co-creating, and keep working towards those better futures for all.